We're very lucky to have with us this year, as part of the Caltech and Huntington Research Institute for History of Science and Technology, Sophia Kalantzakis, who is Global Distinguished Professor in Environmental Studies and Public Policy. I'm Jed Buchwald, Professor of History at Caltech and Director of the Institute. Our first 2 years of this institute have, of course, been shall we say, made a little difficult by the existence of the pandemic. But nevertheless, Sophia has soldiered through and been with us here the entire year and has put together this wonderful and highly timely selection of people to speak to us on this very important topic. With that, I will turn it over to Sophia, who will introduce the speakers and carry on through. Sophia.
Thank you, Jed, and I want to thank everybody for being here. Welcome to the fourth and final session of Rich Rocks, the Climate Crisis and the Tech Imperium. In the past 2 days, we discussed both the geopolitics of decarbonization and digitalization and dedicated 2 sessions to industry. We end our conference with a panel on the socioeconomic and environmental impacts of mining critical minerals that are at the heart of the next wave of global economic transformation. Julie Klinger, Assistant Professor of Geography, University of Delaware, will discuss the social and environmental impacts of rare earth mining and processing. She will pass the baton to Salim Ali, Blue and Gold Distinguished Professor of Energy and the Environment from the University of Delaware, who will introduce us to the ecological and social trade-offs in terrestrial and oceanic mining. The session will conclude with Arjun Bala, Senior Operations Officer at the International Finance Corporation, IFC, who will be discussing Race to Zero, the critical importance of critical minerals. It's truly extraordinary to consider the amount of minerals that will be needed to transform our economies in such a short time. Not only is the project logistically and financially daunting, as we've seen previously from other sessions, but it brings to light what has perhaps been the most overlooked element of this transformation, the fact that it will require unprecedented mining projects all across the world. They are not carbon neutral projects. They consume inordinate amounts of energy and water. Mines in operation are usually located in the developing world where environmental regulations have been less stringent. Ocean mining too is being discussed and standards need to be set. The mining industry has also been under scrutiny and now faces the transition during which it will have to adopt the ESG standards that will be required by the sector. I look forward to hearing these 3 talks and to look forward to a robust Q&A session. Thank you so much.
All right, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Thank you so much, Sophia, Jed, and colleagues for organizing this really important event and for facilitating really important conversations around complex and important but I'll hesitate to say intractable issues. To add to the logistical and conceptual complexity, today I'm talking about social and environmental impacts of rare earth mining and processing. Now, when it comes to social and environmental impacts, over the years, I've recited the manifold ways in which specific forms of rare earth mining and processing can lay waste to landscapes and lives. I've detailed the neurological, orthopedic, cognitive, respiratory, and degenerative illnesses that have been documented among people in Bauto and vicinity, the rare earth capital of the world, and have described the ways in which mining waste travels through waters and soils to make the case that all of us, and by us, I am intentionally including our counterparts in China and across the world concerned with creating a safe, sustainable, just, and secure rare earth supply chain. All of us have a collective interest in investing the necessary resources to make sure that we do things the right way. But what does it mean to do things the right way? Just a moment, my slides aren't advancing here. There we go. Now, what does it mean to do things the right way? Now, after after a decade of talking about the way in which pollutants travel through subsoils and the specific harms that people and livestock that some people depend on have suffered, I can't help but feel a little bit like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day, who realizes he's waking up to relive the same day over and over again every time we see a headline about China's weaponization of rare earth elements. Or of how the rare earth industry is inescapably dirty and dangerous, or how environmental regulation is what killed the US rare earth supply chain. No doubt many seasoned folks in research, policy, and industry identify with this sentiment. And if you haven't seen the movie, I recommend that you watch it as an instructive guide for living, perhaps, in the past decade. Now, mainstream media and policy discourse resolved that dependence on China was a problem about a decade ago. And sometime before that, China's central government resolved that global dependence on China's rare earth reserves was also a problem. This would seem to be a commonality, but we in the US seem to find ourselves trapped in a position of being terrified by the death and dismayed by the death of our domestic and hemispheric rare earth supply chains, and also apparently unable or unwilling to innovate beyond this rather embarrassing status quo. Or to put it less polemically, we keep stepping in the puddle, even though we know where the puddles are, we've studied them exhaustively, and yet somehow we have not been able to do the work necessary to solve the problems with which we are also concerned. There are, of course, many important efforts underway, but I wish to be intentionally provocative here in order to stimulate thought and discussion about how we might move forward. Now, reciting the social and environmental harm seems, in my estimation, to have retrenched this sort of Groundhog Day effect, or the current status quo, because I have found that it is quite easy to imagine the problem of social and environmental devastation of rare earth impacts as uniquely Chinese. Right? There is perhaps a magical belief that perhaps the market will solve everything. And if this happens in the exceptional context of America, maybe we'll magically wake up to a solution that will not require any fundamental changes to the status quo. So with apologies to those who were planning to learn about cancer counts or cognitive delays among children on the Hetao Plain in northern China, or the decimation of nomadic pastoralist livelihoods, you can find this in my book, which is now downloadable for free thanks to an arrangement with Cornell University Press. I will not recite these ailments here. For this symposium, I think we might instead stretch ourselves to aim for something other than stepping in the same old puddle. We all agree that things need to change, but the question is, how do we evaluate change and organize ourselves accordingly so we don't commit the same missteps? So my aim here is to present a very simple scope, a very broad scope, hopefully a slightly terrifying scope for how we might evaluate social and environmental impacts to make sure that the elements that we need to power our green and renewable transition are in fact healthy and green and maybe even renewable for all of us. So a quick note on how to understand and evaluate change. This is a simple two-way test. First, we might ask, is the change regressive? Does it perpetuate or retrench the status quo, which is characterized by the concentration of benefits and the simultaneous intensification and extensification of harms? Or is it progressive in that it transforms the status quo to reduce the intensity and extent of social and environmental harms? Now, my aim, of course, was to take on this thing, right? This thing we're calling the status quo, which is, of course, glibly, simply characterized as digging a big hole somewhere new and then building a trash mountain, but not in my backyard. We have to change, and I am quite encouraged by the proposals that we've heard throughout this conference for how we can actually transform the status quo. But here's actually the question I aim to answer for this conference. Now, I aim to do a straightforward quantitative comparison. So I wanted to compare, how much does it cost to clean up after the fact, right? After the mine, after the spill, after the disaster, after the disease. And how does this compare to upfront investments or ex-ante investments? How much does it cost to comprehensively and continuously prevent social and environmental harms? Now, our prevailing policy approach limits the scope to which industries are able or required to control pollution, whether through circumscribed regulations or limited support for firms investing in or committed to improving safeguards in a competitive market economy. Now, it was actually impossible at this juncture to answer this straightforward quantitative question. Now, there are three primary reasons why. The first is that cost data is not available, right? There are a couple of reasons why cost data is not available, despite the diversity and extent of remediation case studies and documentation at mining sites throughout the world. The costs are actually not well documented. And where some numbers are provided, they are difficult to verify. So reporting is not often required. The cost of cleaning up can be borne by multiple entities, which of course makes straightforward quantitative data difficult to aggregate. And at times it is proprietary to the mine company when an active company is involved in the cost of cleanup. A bigger reason though is that this concept of impacts is actually quite fuzzy. Now, I'm setting aside here the decades of excellent, in-depth, focused social and physical scientific research on the different sorts of impacts of people and on landscapes and lives in mining areas. But more broadly, I mean that impact, like other master concepts such as sustainability, these mean very different things to different people. And so often when I'm looking at these case studies or these reports of social and environmental impacts of mining and processing activities, I find that they are spatially and temporally constrained. So impact typically refers to what happens at the primary sites of mining and processing. Localized case studies and interventions are very important, but the hyper-localization of our concept of social and environmental impacts is actually part of the Groundhog Day problem, because I've found that it doesn't necessarily correspond to the ways in which pollutants from mining and processing activities move through the physical environment, or the way pollutants or the elements themselves embed themselves in human tissues. So different communities also have different definitions of impact. And there is fundamentally the question of who pays. If we're talking about ex post and ex ante, surely we also need to talk about who the stakeholders are involved. Now, from the available data, it is possible to surmise that even in the context of extensive enforcement operations or in response to disasters, the spatial and temporal extent of social and environmental harms are defined according to a rather limited, rather than comprehensive scope. And of course, our concept of who pays, I would say, is correspondingly limited, right? Ultimately, I have found that there's no scenario in which the public does not bear some sort of cost. And I think this should have the effect of shifting the conversation. It is the public that bears the cost. The health and environmental costs of cheaper production. It's the public that bears the cost when supply chains are constricted. And of course, it's the public that bears the cost of upfront investments in socially and environmentally sound production practices, whether through increased costs passed on to the consumer or indirectly through publicly funded research, such as my own. And of course, it is the public that benefits from a stable, safe, clean supply chain. And so ensuring that things are done right, diligently, in a continuously improving manner, I think is worthy of public investment. But now let's talk here just very briefly about how to measure impact, right? The scoping parameters are difficult here. We have to ask, what are the scales involved? Impacts, of course, start with the mine, but where do they end? And of course, again, if we're comparing ex post versus ex ante measures, how are the comparative parameters set? Jurisdictional, temporal, and demographic boundaries versus, for example, the actual movement of pollutants through human and environmental systems, as I mentioned. And of course, in my research in preparation for this conference, I looked around for instructive examples from other sectors, right? Because the proliferation of rare earth elements is relatively new on a generational timescale, and so studies are correspondingly few. Now, more established bodies of research on other elements or other metals can guide our analysis. So impacts, of course, start with the mine, but they don't end there. Specific sites matter. Extraction, storage, transport, processing, sites of use and degradation, and also disposal. And these sites span scales from the global to the personal. Specific states, specifically, I'm not talking about political states, I'm talking about physical states of pollutants. These also matter, right? Pollutants are present across these sites in solid, liquid, and gaseous form, in large and small volumes. And of course, their interactions with the physical environment, which has specific hydrological, atmospheric, and biophysical features, needs to be taken into consideration. And of course, specific people have different levels of exposure, vulnerability, and resilience to these impacts, right? There are, of course, formal and informal interactions with specific sites, and of course, individual variation according to age, gender, and of course, often the kind of labor that you do determines your vulnerability or resilience. And of course, the comparative parameters here are important when we're trying to compare whether it's cheaper actually to do the upfront investment in social and environmental safeguards or to clean up after the fact. Specific sites do still matter if we want to compare these two things. Again, across extraction, storage, transport, processing, use and degradation, and disposal. But the time factor, I find, is the biggest difference between ex ante and ex post cost factors, right? Because the spatial extent of pollution grows with time. Pollution, once discharged into the environment and taken up by soils, by waters, plants, and animals, and wind currents, is very difficult to contain. And this suggests then that ex post cleanup is much more complex and much more expensive, therefore, because contaminants originating from specific sites can interact with other sorts of pollutants from other sources to produce secondary pollutants as well. And so this opens out the question then, right? If we're looking at social and environmental impacts across specific sites that span global to individual scales, then why not talk about a supply chain analysis as well, as long as we're being expansive and rigorous and pushing ourselves to get to the place where we are actually rising to the challenges that confront us. Perhaps there is no outside, there is no externality. Rod Eggert, I believe yesterday, talked about internalizing the externalities. And of course, if we're talking about hazards, we're not just talking about pollutants, about byproducts. We're talking about the unearthed elements themselves that are taken into our cities, our logistical networks, and ultimately our homes and our bodies. And so there are just a couple of instructive examples. There's been an abundance of research on impacts from aluminum, cadmium, and lead, mining, processing, and also exposures later on in the supply chain, particularly in the context of incidences of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. Now, I want to be clear here that I'm not suggesting that our exposure to rare earth elements will lead to Parkinson's or Alzheimer's per se, but research conducted over the past decade in China and the UK, among other places, suggests a long-term epidemiological and chronic disease effect that results from pervasive exposure to pulverized and aerosolized rare earth elements. So we can think of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease as a cost that an elder generation particularly, is paying to a different industrial order. This is a kind of embodied subsidy, or maybe debt, depending on how you're looking at it, that subsidized a previous industrial status quo. And this is, of course, due to exposure to the elements, not to mining-related pollution. And I'm mindful of time here. I'll wrap up in about 90 seconds. Now, the time factor, again, is quite critical, right? And this is because the greatest costs can only be measured in retrospect, well beyond the life of the mine. So we should be asking, what does it take instead to prevent them? The children of the early and mid 20th century who were exposed more so to aluminum, to cadmium and lead in their everyday environments are now the Parkinson's and Alzheimer's cohort that are subject to so much investment and study. And I glossed some of the costs on a US domestic context per year in the conference paper that I submitted. And of course, we have to look at the behavior of these elements inside human bodies. Now, one of the effects that can result from exposure to rare earth elements in particular, which has been found to affect, it's been found to affect sperm motility, it's found to be present in placental tissue, and in laboratory tests on rats, also to inhibit spatial reasoning, apparently. These effects result from the fact that the most commonly used rare earth elements are actually quite similar to calcium in terms of their size, bonding characteristics, coordination geometry, and donor atom preference, which means that rare earths can displace calcium in some biological functions, which means that they disrupt the activities of calcium and calcium-specific receptors and transmembrane channels, which are important for our cells to continue to function. This has widespread effects throughout the human body. Now, the upshot here, I'll just leave this here. This is a preliminary finding from a failed attempt at a study to find that was going to be based on data that is not yet available. But based on the many forms of evidence marshaled from diverse approaches, studying the effects of exposure to pollution from mining, processing, and disposal activities in rare earths and other sectors, it is likely, I posit, that an ex post approach produces greater social and environmental impacts, and therefore significantly increases the costs required to remediate and restore damaged landscapes and lives, where such restorative possibilities exist. Of course, we are talking about certain advanced forms of disease and advanced landscape degradation. Full remediation is not possible. And so impacts do start with the mine, but they are amplified for frontline communities. Direct and indirect exposure is a factor. We must consider the pollutants from mining, processing, and disposal, as well as the elements themselves. And we need to think beyond containment, lest we find ourselves beyond remedy. Now, some questions that will dog this is who is ultimately responsible? I found that among industry and regulatory actors alike, there's a kind of allergy to this sort of expansive thinking. But on the other hand, I'm encouraged by the sort of triangle of innovation that Dr. Roland Goss showed in his earlier presentation today, that presents possibilities for collaboration across multiple sectors to take on these very hairy, very difficult, and also fundamentally very intimate large-scale problems. And so a concluding thought here is we have a choice. We can continue to step in the puddle, or we can hop right over it. All right, thank you very much. And now I will pass the baton to Salim.
Great, thank you so much, Julie, for setting up a fantastic primer on environmental impacts and the scale and scope of environmental impacts around rare earth mining. I'm going to use that framework to some degree to do a comparative analysis of terrestrial and oceanic mining, which covers a range of technology metals, as they're called. Rare earths could be among them, though currently the primary metals that are being considered there are nickel, manganese, and cobalt. So the paper that I'm writing on this for Sophia's project, which she kindly invited us to, has a slightly more sharpened focus on the activism issue, but the presentation I've kept it broader given the audience. And these are just some coordinates if the audience people want to reach me or follow us on social media, etc. But let me start off, first of all, by hearkening back to the Imperium, which is in the title of the symposium. And I tried to make sure I did my homework and found out what the Imperium is. Given Sophia's wonderful Latin lineage, we were given this gift of a title that has many meanings, actually. The Imperium in traditional Roman discourse was a mechanism whereby the citizenry could exert some authority over the military and those who were governing them. So even though the title may seem as though we're talking about the technology sector as having some kind of imperial power, the actual imperium in its etymology was a more dialectical process where the citizenry had some authority over those who were governing them. I think that's very appropriate because the consumer in many ways does have a lot of control over what happens. The investor has control, as we saw in the earlier session as well. So it isn't just, the power dynamics are more complex than sometimes they are assumed to be, and increasingly so in our contemporary world. We think about the possible sources of these metals, terrestrial mining in regions with a lot of competing human uses. You can, if you're mining, you could potentially be taking away agricultural land, you could be taking away land in urban areas for property development and a range of those issues. You could also be undertaking terrestrial mining where there may not be competing human use, but you are impacting other organisms and biodiversity usage. So that's part of this menu of possible sources of metals within this imperium. You have coastal mining underwater, but within national waters. That's another area of interest. Places like Namibia, for example, where there's been diamond mining that's been happening in the coastal areas. So there is some proximate impact on coastal communities, but there are not the same kind of property rights issues that you may have with terrestrial mining. And it's more in the realm of common property and usage and nuisance law and so on. And then you have oceanic mining, which is going into international waters, very different from coastal mining. And I make that distinction because there's been a lot of conflation in the activist discourse about one particular project called the Nautilus Project in Papua New Guinea, a country where I've had the pleasure of doing field work. And that project was in coastal territorial waters of the country of Papua New Guinea, very different from oceanic mining, which is being currently deliberated within the law of the sea convention, that is out in open waters, in international waters, and not in the same kind of community impact nexus as you would have with coastal. Yes, there could be some impacts in terms of shipping and potentially fisheries, the high fisheries and so on, but very different from coastal mining. And then finally, you have recycled sources of metals from stocks. And this is something we've already talked about in the symposium quite a bit, but recycling presents a conundrum because, of course, at the end of the day, we all want a circular economy. We want to have biomimicry of natural systems which are circular, and we want to have human and synthetic systems which are able to follow that circularity. But with the conundrum is that in order to recycle, you need to first have the stock of the metal. And if you want to have the stock, you sometimes have to then make the product less durable so you can have the stock. So you need to have some very interesting calculations through mechanisms and fields like industrial ecology, which are able to then calculate like what is the optimal impact that you would get from having more circulation of the metal versus virgin mining coming into the supply stream. And then the social context comes in as well, because there are livelihoods linked to going to recycle or mine. And the classic case is gold. Gold is eminently recyclable. From a circular economy, industrial ecology perspective, we should not be mining any gold whatsoever because there is far more stock of gold than we need in terms of above ground resources. Most of it is lying in bank vaults, in national reserve banks. And if we no longer use the gold standard, so we could conceivably have very controlled release of that gold. And we would have more than enough to go through cycling that through the uses, even through jewelry uses and even accounting for growth. But the reason we don't do that is because we have the financial imperatives for some reliance that people want to have for that gold that is just sitting in the bank vaults. And secondly, because there are livelihoods connected to gold. There are countries like Ghana, where Arjun has worked and others who have developed as a result of using gold mining for revenue generation and livelihoods. There are 20 million artisanal miners who rely on gold. So the social context comes in, and the ecological is often in conflict with it in those terms. And so that's another aspect of the conundrum of recycling, which of course at a core principle level, we should all be supporting. Now, some years ago, myself and a group of scholars, especially geoscientists, we published this paper in Nature that looked at mineral supply and governance issues around, especially the challenge of sourcing the green technology transition. And what we've argued there is that we really need to have a global governance mechanism whereby we can track much better the ore grades that are declining and the issues related to that, and how we are going to have the management of a lot of the conflicts that are surrounding the extraction process on land. And we looked at data which showed how much project delays have been increasing over time across with new mineral projects. We also looked at the exploration deficit. You know, the private capital arena is not responding to societal needs. There is clearly some kind of disconnect, what economists would call a market failure perhaps, that most of the exploration has been going into gold, which I just told you from an ecological point of view makes no sense to mine. But the market is responding to this artifice that we have created around gold demand for a variety of other reasons, as noted, genuine reasons. But again, the ecological metrics are not concomitant with it. And those are not, gold is not something that you need. Most of it is going into jewelry. But the price signaling for investors, and that's why you have all these junior companies which are investing in gold. And up to 2015, when we looked at the data, 1/3 of it was gold. If you go back in the 1980s, more than almost 2/3 was going into gold. But the metals which we need, like the rare earth metals and even some of these other technology metals like cobalt, we did not have that level of investment going in. So much as the market should be doing this, like society needs it, markets respond, it doesn't work so simply. And you have to contend with this dynamic. We also looked at recycling in that paper, and the projections that are available, and more recent work has been done on this too. Clearly, recycling is not going to be adequate to meet the demands. We hope it will be eventually, and we should move towards that for especially these technology metals, but we need to be able to mine in the meantime to reach that. So for green technologies particularly, this diagram is showing you the growth that is occurring, especially with reference to these various technology metals. And it is unprecedented. And Bloomberg has done more recent work. In fact, Bloomberg, the head of mining and metals now at Bloomberg, is a former PhD student of ours from the University of Queensland, where I used to be based and still have affiliation. And it's a wonderful chap named Kwasi Mpofo, Dr. Kwasi Mpofo. And he has just published more recently a report that is even more, ambitious and bullish about the rise of these technology metals, and especially the need that is going to be coming through from these green technologies. Now, in terms of the biodiversity arena, this is from a paper that we worked on that looked at where the mining is in terms of biodiversity hotspots. And it was published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society a few years ago. And clearly, in terms of terrestrial mining, a lot of it is happening in sensitive ecosystems or in close proximity to sensitive ecosystems. So this raises other concerns then. If you're going to be comparing where you're getting your metals from, this kind of analysis has to be considered if you're worried about conservation and impacts on ecosystem services. And biodiversity then indirectly links to human welfare, of course, as we know. And the Convention on Biological Diversity is aimed at giving us that protection. There's also the environmental justice argument, which is important, that a lot of the mining where we are undertaking it, if social impacts and community impacts are going to be occurring in those countries where there is poorer governance, what is our responsibility? And this was a point earlier in the symposium where our colleague from the New York Times Shanghai Bureau was commenting that for him, that was one of the key lessons from visiting the Mountain Pass mine in California, was that in many ways, there was a certain selfishness in terms of the activism that was saying, no, no, you shan't mine here because we don't want it here. And then the metal demand goes to a developing country where there may not be as much governance in place to actually deliver the benefits that those communities deserve. So it's a real balancing act, because you want to provide the livelihoods, but you want to make sure you have the governance so the livelihoods are actually provided in a sustainable way. And you don't end up with the kind of kleptocracy that we have seen with many of these countries, including the Democratic Republic of Congo, where you have currently over 60% of the world's cobalt. And this is from another recent paper from some of the same colleagues of ours at the University of Queensland, which we worked with. And it's looking at global mining areas and their density overall. And the same argument is being made in terms of what is happening there. There are some notable exceptions with reference to Canada and Australia, where there is this high density and low populations. And certainly that's where a lot of the exploration investment is also going. But it's not clear. I mean, some of it is geologically determined. We have to know that, we cannot just, unlike other kinds of industrial development where you can just take a factory and put it somewhere, you can't do that with terrestrial mineral resources. So oceanic reserves, are they an answer? This is potentially a tellurium reserve, which was found by the British Geological Survey, one of the world's largest tellurium reserves off the Canary Islands. And tellurium, as you know, is used for solar panels. Should we be looking into the ocean? And so this question has been put forward. And of course, manganese nodules in the Clarion-Clipperton zone is where most of this international waters effort is going through. And this is sort of between Hawaii and Mexico, and no inhabited islands there at all. And that's where when we talk about deep sea mining, that's where essentially most of the investment is going. And this is just looking at like the comparison in terms of reserves from another paper that was published last year. And it's very considerable and deserves attention in this regard. Now, the challenge is, what the marine activist community with very good intentions is posing to us is that we need to be careful. We do not know enough about the deep sea, and hence we need to exercise precaution. So the precautionary principle is invoked, which is actually part of the Law of the Sea Convention, and in terms of how the International Seabed Authority, which was an institution that was developed as part of the convention to manage and govern these resources, calls for. But we have to unpack it. Precautionary principle, what does it mean? We have to ask in terms of, where do we have the parameters around this? And there are some really good documents. The IUCN prepared a primer on how to operationalize the precautionary principle. Precaution doesn't mean paralysis. In fact, I'm planning to write a paper at some point, precaution or paralysis. I think that should be fun to write. But this call for moratoria is quite intriguing, and it's a very kind of safe policy approach. Like, we don't know enough. Let's just stop. Let's just call it time out, and let's figure things out. But of course, we are dealing with the climate crisis. We have other urgencies which cannot necessarily contend with timeout indefinitely, right? So the call for moratoria is another thing which has been unpacked, and it's a big policy debate. I just wrote a short article, if you're interested, on Springer Nature's online sustainability community about the politics of moratoria. And they have been used in the case of Antarctica. In the Convention on Biological Diversity, there was a call for a moratorium on gene drive technology, which was rejected. So it's another very intriguing way of operationalizing the precautionary principle, which we can talk about. So biodiversity concerns in the oceans, a lot of them, is conflation that happens, but it's important to keep in mind that the mining that is likely to occur is not in the hydrothermal vents. the ones where you have those marvelous organisms where life probably originated. I mean, this is where we think that the emergent principles that allowed complex life to form from chemical mechanisms, and my pedigree is as a chemist, so I'm absolutely fascinated by all that. But that's not where we're talking about the primary places where the mining is likely to occur. It's more in the polymetallic nodules, which are fascinating in and of themselves. They take hundreds of thousands of years to emerge, and they've got some great microfauna. But keep in mind, in the deep sea, there are no plants. So you take one tier of biodiversity completely out. There are no plants in the deep sea because there's no light. But you have some fascinating microbes and also some other organisms as well, which deserve our attention. But everything is relative, and we have to have some metrics of comparing. We cannot have just randomly say everything is valuable, because you have to figure out some way of comparing. So this is just an example of what kind of wonders lie in the deep sea, which are indeed fascinating. So the cobalt sources, as noted, DRC is a big deal there, but you have some of these other countries also coming through. But that's where cobalt is really driving a lot of the work there. So if we were to do a comparison, then we have to think about comparing from a technical point of view, the various environmental impact criteria of oceanic versus terrestrial mining. And generally, in terms of waste generation, and also this is a waste generation example of on the top is what you would do for a nodule, and on the bottom is what you would do for a terrestrial mine. Big difference in terms of amount of chemicals used, waste generated, much less for oceanic minerals than for terrestrial minerals. We have done some research. This was published just in the Journal of Cleaner Production. Our waste research is under review currently with a journal. But this one on carbon also, there is a huge difference in terms of the carbon footprint between terrestrial and oceanic mining. Oceanic mining has a much lesser carbon footprint than terrestrial mining. And we showed this through this analysis as well. So, these are the impact. If you really want to get to the core impact criteria, that is why I have been willing to engage with the oceanic mineral conversation. And then finally, the governance system. The International Seabed Authority has been around for over 2 decades. It's not perfect, but it has been developing environmental regulations and so on. And so at least there is this governance system. There is no such international governance system for terrestrial mining. It's all national. And you can have a race to the bottom. You have to rely on voluntary principles. And you have far more complexity around social impacts by any measure. I mean, it's a no-brainer that the social impacts of working in property rights issues in remote African villages is not the same as the Clarion-Clipperton zone. And then the other aspect is small island developing states, many of whom are willing to support, some of whom are not. Fiji is not willing to support deep sea mining because they have a flourishing tourist industry. They don't need other things, which even that is suffering now with COVID. But some of these other countries, they do have an interest, and they've been willing to support it as a diversification mechanism. Keep in mind, this is not mining they are doing in their own territorial waters. As members of the UN, they can be a co-sponsoring state for a mining venture in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. So there would be no direct environmental impact to those islands where these states are sponsoring. They're using their UN membership card to partner and do this mining. Because according to the law of the Sea Convention, you need to have a sponsoring state which partners with a contractor to do that mining. And Nauru and other countries like that, where I have done quite a bit of field work as well, are doing exactly that. And then you have the circular economy trajectory, which has been talked about. And this is very interesting that some of these deep sea mining contractors have said that they are interested in planned obsolescence, that they want to not be around in perpetuity. Once there is enough metal stock, they want to actually see themselves become obsolete, which is fascinating, I see, from an organizational perspective as well, that's kind of the business model they're willing to embrace. And then, this is some recent work that's been done by one of the scientists who works for one of the contractors, Samantha Smith, and she's done this work in terms of SDG analysis, which is also very interesting because currently everything is being measured in terms of SDGs. And so this is where also the seafloor minerals area can be very interesting. So Now, the issue is conflict is still there. There is a huge movement. There are like 300 marine scientists who have signed a call and said, we don't want to have deep sea mining. There's a lot of contention. The Twitter sphere is all abuzz with it. And so, why am I putting myself in this situation where I'm saying, we should go ahead and look into it? And the main reason is because I'm someone who has studied conflict for past 20 years, environmental and social conflict around mining. And if you really get to the nub of the issue in terms of the community conflicts, that is where you have the kind of really awful impacts that Julie was talking about. And so as a system scientist, I look at those concentric circles that Julie put forward, right? And I cannot just be one of those 300 marine scientists who is looking just at one part of that circle. I have to look at all of them together. And that's where the terrestrial oceanic analysis comes through. That's where the life cycle analysis methods are helpful. It could be that for some areas, the analysis comes out very much against oceanic mining. Maybe for hydrothermal vents, I would say it would come out very negative, probably. But for nodules, at least it deserves a chance. So none of us should make up our mind until the analysis comes forth, and we should not put brakes on even doing the analysis. So this is from a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy. What I was trying to address in this with our colleagues, the co-authors, was that we are trying to look at it from the point of view of social risk and business risk, and how the risk conflict becomes a regulator between social risk and business risk that we need to consider. So how do we go about it? This is some other work we've done in terms of public-private partnerships and how the industry can develop further, whether it's the oceanic mineral industry or the terrestrial mineral industry. On the oceanic side, there is already a public-private partnership approach, because you have some mechanisms whereby there is this conversation happening between the private sector and governments. On the terrestrial side, one of the problems is the green tech firms, which is where we have the demand for the metals. They are often not even projecting properly how much metals they're going to need. So what this model suggests is better communication between supply and demand centers. It brings in the circular economy, it brings in environmental and social risks, it brings in the stockpile issue, which has been neglected as well. And it looks at this from a systems perspective. So it's titled Smart Mineral Enterprise Development Model. And it's just like we talk about smart grids, here we're talking about smart mineral enterprise between supply and demand, quick feedback loops so you can actually come up with that kind of analysis. The science policy interface is another way of looking at the same issue. And this is from a diagram from a book we put together on Africa's mineral fortune, where we looked at this is where the science policy interface is, the geoscience data, the socioeconomic data, and the ecological impact data. And we need fields like industrial ecology to help us in this regard. And this is actually a diagram from the article we are contributing, that I'm contributing for this book that Sophia is editing. And it's essentially saying, look, this is how we need to think about natural capital and planetary boundaries. And DFE is designed for environment. So electric car batteries, solar, wind, and so on. We have to think about them in this fashion and use these methods to make sure there is effective design so that all of these three sources can be optimally used moving forward. So essentially, I'm going over time, so I'll just, this is basically regurgitating the same and summarizing. Essentially, what I'm asking for is a systems approach for us to think about it. There may be other technologies. I'm all for innovation. There could be organic radical batteries. We could find some new other techniques, but the reality is there are limits to innovation, and there are chemical limits to innovation. In terms of certain technologies, we're reaching some level of saturation with some technologies. And so we have to be conscious of that as well. Okay, and so that's kind of how we have to think about. Alternatives are important, and I'm all for that, but let's look at the alternatives from a systems perspective. And finally, just for those of you interested in shameless self-promotion for our program, since we have 2 University of Delaware faculty on this panel, we have a Minerals, Materials, and Society program, and we've also launched this new online portal for conversation on mineral choices. which will soon be also partnering with other entities like the London Natural History Museum. So we would welcome your engagement. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. As Sophia had already introduced, my name is Arjun Bala, and I work at the IFC, which is a member of the World Bank Group. So just want to give a huge thanks to Sophia, Jed, and my fellow panelists, Salim and Julie, for the opportunity today to speak about the World Bank Climate Smart Mining Initiative, and specifically around two pieces of work that we're undertaking, which is around net zero roadmaps for the copper and nickel value chains, and also some guidance for the private sector in building resilience in communities surrounding mining projects. So for those of you who don't know, IFC is the largest global development institution focused on the private sector in developing countries. And I mentioned that today I'm going to be kind of speaking jointly for the World Bank and IFC on behalf of the Climate Smart Mining Initiative. And what that is it supports the sustainable extraction, processing, and recycling of minerals and metals needed to secure supply for low carbon technologies by creating shared value and also delivering social, economic, and environmental benefits throughout the value chain in emerging markets. I think Julie and Salim did an excellent job of kind of looking at what those specific impacts are on the ground, and then also looking at different types of alternatives for mining, which can be less carbon intensive. So I'm going to take slightly a higher level view of some of the trends that we're seeing in the market, and more specifically, the role of critical minerals for the low carbon economy. So the agenda, these are the key sort of topics that I'd like to touch on during the talk today. One will be something that you all are very familiar with, which is obviously the climate challenge. Secondly, I'd like to talk about some of the key innovations necessary to drive decarbonization in mineral supply chains. So this is not only looking at mining operations themselves, but also looking across the value chain. And then talk about briefly some guidance on supplying critical minerals and metals in a manner consistent with achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And I don't think there's a day that goes by that we don't pick up the newspaper and see another country or company making a commitment to net zero by 2050. And lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about how building mining operations that properly diagnose climate risk and enhance resilience, not only just to physical assets, but also to those surrounding communities, will be essential if we're going to move toward this low carbon economy in a sustainable manner. So as many of you know, the climate crisis is upon us. Global mean temperatures have risen by more than 1 degree Celsius since the industrial age. And the impacts of climate change, we see more and more, including the increase in intensity and frequency of extreme weather events, changes in the distribution of water, and the functioning of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and a variety of threats to public health, including a rise in vector and waterborne diseases, which Julie has succinctly covered. And the science compels us to hold global mean temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level. And in order to do this and achieve net zero, we have to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and other carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. So net zero emissions requires the urgent and sustained deployment of renewable energy technologies. And this is really focused on wind and solar, energy transmission, and storage. So by 2050, almost 90% of global electricity will need to come from renewables, with solar and PV accounting for, solar PV and wind accounting for nearly 70% of this. Electric vehicles will also need to replace internal combustion engines by the middle of the next decade. So I always show people this graph, and you guys may have come across it yourselves, but it's from a World Bank report, and the IEA have also been developing similar studies around this, but looking at if we're to meet this 1.5 degree Celsius commitment, we're going to need a huge production of different minerals and metals. And so this graph here just kind of depicts what are the 17 minerals and metals that will be needed at scales beyond current production levels to drive this transition to net zero by 2050. So just some quick factoids for you all. Like, an electric car requires 6 times the mineral inputs of a conventional car, and an onshore wind plant requires 9 times more mineral resources than a gas-fired power plant. The result is that graphite demand will also increase by 500% from 2018 levels to meet the growing demand in automotive grid and decentralized batteries. Nickel will also need to double in production. Cobalt will need to grow 5 times its current size, while lithium will need to grow nearly 12 times the current levels to meet this demand. So relative to 2020 levels, annual copper demand from solar PV installation could more than double by 2030 and almost triple by 2050. I was reading somewhere that we've produced more than 550 million tons of copper in the last 100 years or so, and we need to mine that exact same amount in the next 25 years to meet this demand for renewable energy technology. So global efforts to meet the demand for critical minerals and metals will need to be sustained and supported to become sustainable. And so the scale of the financing, especially working with an international financial institution, is going to be huge. So by 2020, there's estimates that annual capital spending on clean energy in developing countries will need to grow above $1 trillion to put the world on track to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Together, aluminum, graphite, and nickel production from energy technologies account for a cumulative 1.4 gigatons of CO2 emissions up to 2050, which is nearly equivalent to the 2018 carbon dioxide emissions from France, Germany, and the UK combined. So consequently, we must work to decarbonize the critical minerals and value chain as we work together to meet the growing demand. In other words, we can't just continue to meet this growing demand for renewable energy technologies and while the actual mining activities themselves are very carbon intensive. So creating net zero pathways for critical minerals and metals will involve a combination of principles and practices. So some of the things that we're seeing from some of the major companies, which we hope to see from the sector more broadly, include a pledge from the corporation's senior management to achieve net zeros in their critical minerals and supply chains by mid-century at the latest. Second, develop a tangible plan with short and medium-term goals, including interim targets for 2030. So not just saying that we're going to be net zero by 2050. Specify specific targets for emission reductions and removals and provide details on offsets. 4, share information on emission reduction measures to facilitate good practice replication. Document stakeholder consultation approaches to demonstrate ownership of these plans, and commit to a timeline for the revision and ambition to establish an ambition and ratchet mechanism. So in terms of what mining companies are currently doing to sort of green their operations, one is a very obvious one, which is around electrification through solar, wind, and hydropower, including blue and green hydrogen to power mines and transport fleets. We know that this is challenged from the session before in terms of negotiating and structuring PPAs with governments. But the price has gone down and the technology has advanced where mining companies can feel more safe and confident in the supply of clean energy for their mines. And just to give you an example, removing 6.1 billion liters of diesel a year at copper mines would save around a quarter of their mine GHG emissions. So transport is a huge lever in order to decarbonize operations. And we're seeing a lot of work around these types of initiatives, particularly around the Clean and Safe Vehicle Initiative by the International Council of Mining and Metals. Apart from electrification, recycling and reuse of minerals can play a huge role in reducing emissions, and Salim alluded to this in his talk. So for example, production of aluminum from scrap takes only 5% of the energy required to smelt aluminum. Water use is a huge factor as mines are located in more and more remote regions. Pumping costs to get the water to the mine sites can be quite expensive. So looking at different technologies to reduce and use water more efficiently will be critical to building resilient mining operations. Lastly, nature-based solutions also represent a very cost-effective way to reduce emissions, particularly activities such as tree planting and deforestation reduction. Nature-based solutions can also contribute to carbon removal through afforestation and agricultural soil management, complement emerging innovations in carbon sequestration, such as direct capture and storage technology, and carbon capture and storage and enhanced mineralization. So as we work to achieve net zero, we must also manage the climate risk that has become a feature of everyday life across the globe. Enhancing resilience is both a moral imperative and essential for decarbonization, as many of the resource-rich developing countries who will meet the growing demand for critical minerals and metals are amongst the most at risk from climate change. There's quite a compelling graphic I'd like to show you on this. which is where is all these critical minerals going to come from? And if you look at these countries, these are some of the most countries that are susceptible to climate change. And so managing the environmental and social impacts from mining and also building the resilience of host communities around mining operations will be critical to ensuring a just transition. So we can also enhance climate resilience by improving our diagnosis of risk. Climate risk consists of the existence of physical hazards, exposure to those hazards, and vulnerability. And vulnerability here is really the key one, as it's the underlying weaknesses that exacerbate risks. And in many instances, conflict, as Salim was mentioning as well. So this vulnerability can be a weakness in infrastructure, or it can also be a weakness in the resiliency of local communities as intersecting social, cultural, economic, and political inequalities exacerbate risks. And most companies that we see are underestimating the importance of vulnerability in their enterprise risk management systems, and therefore failing to properly diagnose risk and respond to climate risks. So we can further enhance climate resilience by investing in 6 so-called capital assets. These are human, social, natural, physical, financial, and political. So what can companies do? So to enhance human capital, companies can invest in skills and training to cultivate agents of broader workplace, household, and community resilience. A company might also enhance social capital by establishing structured dialogue with workers, local communities, other local stakeholders to evaluate risk and create strategies for resilience. Companies might work to enhance natural capital by maintaining wetlands, expanding forested areas, and improving water management. There are numerous investments in physical capital that reduce risks, such as cyclone shelters, flood defenses, and adopting and strengthening building codes. Companies can also enhance financial capital through the provision of insurance schemes, income and asset livelihood diversification, and improved employment practices. Companies can enhance political capital by advocating the extension of social safety nets, gender equality, and improved access to information, decision-making, and justice. So mining, has a vital and central role in the development of this climate-compatible economy. So over the next 18 months, we're really excited at the World Bank to be working with stakeholder groups across mining, transport, and other sectors in the value chain to find ways to meet the growing demand for critical minerals and metals, to do so in a way that drives decarbonization and in a manner that delivers resilience and shared prosperity to resource-rich communities across the globe. Thank you very much.
Okay, these were fantastic presentations, and they've really, how would you say, focused on, some of the implications. I mean, when we're racing to decarbonize and digitalize the economy and transform the global economy in these ways, we've talked about the inputs, but we hadn't spoken until this session about the extent of the socioeconomic and environmental impacts. I mean, I guess the question is, again, this seems like such a tall order. We know that there's going to be tremendous amounts of mining. We know that they're in the most vulnerable parts of the world, in parts of the world where the governance system is not as transparent. A lot of times I hear conversations from major institutions, including the World Bank, where they keep asking for more transparency, more good governance. But is this in order to invest there? So it's sort of a catch-22. And I was wondering, Arjun, and where does some of the things that they're saying are unrealistic, almost, or first you need to fix the system, or you need to fix the system in parallel with investing in helping them transition into the smart mining. Where are we on this conversation? Because it seems as if there's so many moving parts, and so, and even from Salim's presentation of all of the different stages, there's so many different actors, so many different enterprises, so many different footprints. How do we really move past the how you say, wishful thinking and the good practices on paper to the reality on the ground.
Do you want me to start with that, Sophia?
Yes, please.
Okay, sure.
It's just a small thing.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, it's a catch-22, right? I mean, a lot of these countries where these critical minerals are depend on this resource base. They want more foreign direct investment in their countries. They want more value addition in those countries as well, because typically, the graph I showed you where all these minerals are coming, usually are mined there, and then they're shipped around the world to be refined, processed, and to manufacture the end product. So, one of the things that we're doing with the World Bank, and especially my colleagues on the public sector side, is developing climate smart mining roadmaps for these different countries. So what are the types of policy, the incentives that you need to encourage more climate smart mining? So you are seeing, it's tough. It sounds great. It's tough to implement. I mean, a lot of countries will be dragging their heels along this process, but they also made nationally determined contributions as part of their commitment to the Paris Agreement. So these are ways that can not only help them through the public sector engagements and their activities meet those targets, but also the mining sector, which plays a huge role in some of these countries. So I think it's going to be, much more of a sustained effort. I think it's going to involve a lot more pressure coming from the mining sector, not just specifically from, the top 5 big mining companies to really push and drive this change, as they've already made those public commitments. And I think for these countries that are going to be experiencing these types of physical impacts on climate change, some of these transition risks will be really important to manage through regulation and incentives. So yeah, it's going to take time and it's going to take persistence. But we're already starting to see that with new greenfield projects developed in Indonesia and Brazil, which are supplying a lot of these critical minerals, really wanting to get it right done the first time. And I think Julie had the best metaphor for this, where she showed pictures of Bill Murray not stepping into the same pond or stream twice. And I think this is the time for them to kind of rectify some of the mistakes that we've seen in the past. But they will need some additional handholding because there's not a lot of precedence in this space in some of these jurisdictions where we're trying to do more of this mining.
I just wanted to do a follow-up question on this about the banking system. I mean, is it just the World Bank that are other banks that are international banks that are in the business of loaning money for these kinds of huge projects? Are they all on the same page about the kinds of smart mining practices, roadmaps that you're proposing?
Yeah, I mean, they sit on our steering committee. So we've heard a lot of noise in the last 18 months where we were testing the waters to see who would kind of step up to the plate, because as you need this technology to decarbonize your mining operations, banks have huge balance sheets. The mining companies have huge balance sheets, but their core investors, are these handful of banks which have also made these similar pledges and commitments. So we've seen them come out in droves to attend our sessions, to seeing what types of financial instruments they can make available, how they can kind of incentivize these companies to do things. So, HSBC, Credit Agricole, Societe Generale, Bank of Nova Scotia, they're all putting a lot of money behind this. And also the multilaterals, EBRD, the Africa Development Bank, IFC, the World Bank, are making huge commitments, financial commitments around this. We just released our 5-year climate change action plan, where we have to double our investments in renewable energy from 26% of our overall portfolio to close to 46%, I believe, in the next few years. So our board is demanding this and wanting us to push not only upstream mining companies, but those downstream players to source these minerals in a sustainable way. And there seems to be a huge financial commitment and appetite to fund these types of projects. So the shortage of money and finance is really not a challenge. It's finding good bankable projects and operating in jurisdictions where you have a clean line of sight into risk and managing that risk. But capital won't be the problem to deploy.
Right. This issue of risk and regulation and what is allowed and not allowed, because it doesn't make sense, not only because there might be civil war or there might be local unrest, but also questions of corruption and transparency. These are big issues that get investors in tremendous trouble if they even if they would have an appetite for risk. Dealing with all these repercussions is huge. Julie, I mean, you really framed it just beautifully. Plus, I love that movie. And the question I have now is, okay, it would seem to be the natural thing to do it right from the beginning, except it hasn't been. I mean, there are efforts now to rectify, or perhaps newer investments are done. There are new environmental regulations and a bigger follow-up and oversight. We talked a little bit about that with China. There used to be the situation before consolidation may have been absolutely, let's say, chaotic or unruly or horrific even. And now, the government has stepped in to have a consolidation and to really try to manage those outliers who were illegally mining and degrading the environment and sort of streamlining the industry. But beyond rare earths, generally speaking, I see the dichotomy, but if it's such a clear equation, why not?
That's such an excellent question. Thank you. So I think, one of the driving and underappreciated factors for the transformation that we've witnessed unfold over the past, I guess, 13 or 14 years now in China's extractive sector is really driven by grassroots activism. So people tend not to have a lot of patience when their land and their water is degraded. And they are even less patient when they witness public health crises unfolding around them and they see their loved ones suffer. And so this is a phenomenon that I've actually written about more recently, and linking the policy changes within China to the spatial transformations that we're witnessing in extractive and infrastructural sectors in certain Belt and Road partner states in Central Eurasia. But the fundamental question of why not, I think it's actually a pretty straightforward question of the question of who is expected to bear the risk and how the incentives are aligned. So when it comes to assuming risk, the focus of my talk today was really on, the sort of the tangible and intangible risks or costs that are aggregated on what we'll broadly define as the public. Right, downstream communities, downwind communities, laborers, and people caught in the crossfire of all of these less savory processes that we've mentioned throughout this conference. But there's another aspect in which we've aggregated risk that I think is actually fundamentally inhibiting our ability to innovate in the ways that actually generate greater social and environmental security, and therefore, by consequence, greater supply chain security. And that is, that in a competitive market economy, in that context, there's actually very few incentives for firms who want to do the right thing, right? To make the upfront investments. And certainly, it's despite, occasional rhetoric about, needing to green supply chains or that sort of thing, we also don't really have many support mechanisms in place for downstream firms who would like to, send a greener, more sustainable market signal by purchasing more expensive products from firms that make the investments upfront. And so the expectation, right, our policy framework has really been such that all of the risk is concentrated on the firm. And, this, I think, has actually done a lot to stifle innovation in this area. And this is why I make the case in terms of public interest, because I think that if we could, this is the word of the conference, but I'm going to use it in a different sense, right? If we could decouple this sense of mitigating social and environmental harms from this question of upfront liability and public image concerns for a specific firm, and instead make it a matter of what it actually is, right, which is public interest, therefore important matter for public dialogue and things like this, then I think we would see a pretty radical transformation in business as usual. But that, of course, involves realigning the incentives. And this, I think, actually speaks to some points that Arjun raised in his previous response to your question. I think that without a fundamental realignment of incentives for investment, I think it will be difficult to see the sorts of unsavory practices, whether it's governance or labor abuses or environmental degradation. I think it will be difficult to see these overcome, right? Because in a competitive market economy, it's important for investors to get a return on their investment, right? And this includes multilateral banks and that sort of thing as well. But there are other financing models, I think, that do offer a pathway forward, most notably Fundo Amazonia, or the Amazon Fund, which is overseen by BNDES in Brazil, provides a sort of non-reimbursable project-based funding for programs that do actually help keep the Amazon rainforest intact. And I think that there's a lot that we could learn from that model in terms of building out the kind of infrastructure that we need to see in order to truly green our supply chain, right? So the question of why not, I think it has to do with risk and incentive. And we can't, I'm going to quote Arundhati Roy here. She says, the middle-class environmentalist asks, how could we change without changing? And I think this is the dilemma that we're in, right? We do need to fundamentally change where we concentrate the risk and what counts as the most compelling incentive.
So part of the problem is that the entire economic model is structured around this perennial growth, greater expectations on return for investment, and things costing nothing. Every time there's a dilemma, we ask, well, but that'll drive up the costs. And it's a very important question, and I'm curious to see if you think that this idea also of the cost of things, the cost of services, the cost of is part of this conversation. Is it has the public, because you're emphasizing the public so much, but the public too, when it has to weigh its threshold for like a price increase versus maybe pollution or having a job or having some kind of economic opportunity, how do they weigh it in? And how has this suddenly become only the responsibility of the public? I mean, the public has like so many responsibilities. It's like everything's become an individual choice. Yes.
I'd like to, I'll briefly respond, Salim, and then turn it over to you. Well, I think that, the public is already bearing the responsibility for our status quo. There are the ways that I talked about, but if we want to just talk about dollars and cents, there was a 2019 IMF report that found that the fossil fuel industry in the year 2015 had captured 85% of all energy subsidies worldwide, right? And let me just find the numbers here. In that same year, in 2015, the US federal government provided $649 billion with a B in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, which exceeded the entire military and defense budget, right? And remember, this is the country that spends more on its military than every other country in the world combined. This exceeded the entire military and defense budget by 50 billion, right? So if we compare these annual public expenditures to, say, Eisenhower's Federal Highway Act, which unfolded over 40 years, or FDR's New Deal, right? The Highway Act over 40 years cost about $500 billion, right, in 2018 dollars. And FDR's New Deal, right, cost about, here I'm just going to look at the numbers here, about 760 billion, right? But that produced a lot of the infrastructure that we still enjoy today in the US. And so I think the public is already bearing the cost of the status quo. And it's a matter of looking squarely, right, at the actual numbers, right, at the cost data, so that we can free ourselves from these traps of, oh my goodness, it costs too much. Because we do invest in the things that we prioritize, right? That's clearly been the record, and that continues to be the case, certainly for the fossil fuel industry. Sorry about that. Salim, go ahead.
Salim, yes.
No, I mean, I think the key issue is also one of what kind of metrics do we recognize? And the role of science and policy making, for me, is currently at a very disconcerting point, because even when there's an effort made by perhaps the middle class environmentalists that Arundhati Roy has scorned for, to put like a dollar value on nature. Like Sir Partha Das Gupta just published this report on the cost of nature and biodiversity service. I mean, it's basically about putting a dollar value on nature. They were put through the laundry about why are you trying to put a dollar value on nature? Now, their aim was well-intentioned. It was like, if we don't put a dollar value on it, it will get no value. But they were put through the ringer because they were like, how dare you try to measure the value of some organism? Well, they're doing it because if you don't do it, then you will be accused of neglecting it. So I think there is a challenge we have also, much as I agree with Julie that there's been this terrible subsidy given to a lot of polluters, including fossil fuels. We have the converse that the environmental movement is not willing to have any kind of measurement, risk analysis. They have become so positional and in every way kind of confrontational about solutions, that you end up in this catch-22 dilemma. So when innovations are developed, each time, I mean, Caltech is developing all these amazing new technologies, you've got new enzymes being developed. I mean, great work by Francis Arnold, all these amazing things that are being done. And then you amplify the risk by saying that, oh, but this could go wrong with the RNA and you could all end up in, a most dire predicament. You have to look at the science with much greater care. And this is what Roger Kasperson called the social amplification of risk, and he is a very distinguished geographer, member of the National Academy of Sciences. That's the kind of dilemma we have. And as someone who has very strong environmental sensibilities, I'm really saddened to see this happening, because we end up in this situation where then we can have no policy solutions. And mining is confronting that, time and again, like the IFC. If you look at the World Bank has the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman's Office, which was set up by the bank to get complaints from communities about World Bank investments. Number one in all of the list is mining. All complaints, anyone can send a complaint. And there, Arjun probably has to respond to some of these complaints. They go on, I mean, so it is just like, it's a no-win dynamic. And that's why, thank goodness for tenure and all that now, I'm willing to sort of say, look, this is it. But there are academics who get put through the ringer and saying, oh, you are in the pocket of this industry or that industry or this, just being shamed, stigmatized constantly. It is an oppressive situation, really. And someone like me has to do a lot of constant, pushback and say, look, my integrity is what it is because I want to look at the science and make the decisions based on the science. So it's a challenge. While I sympathize, I'm coming from a developing country, I sympathize with the developing world. My father grew up in abject poverty in Pakistan. I totally understand what it means to be the underdog. But at the same time, decisions have to be made based on some objective criteria. If we make everything morally relativistic, we will end up in a paralyzed society.
Arjun?
I think Salim hit it on the head. There's not much to add to that. I mean, he's absolutely right in terms of the complaints that we get, particularly around mining. That's, it's the number one sector. And if you go into what is the issue that they're complaining about, typically it has to do with water, mining taking place.
But this is such a real concern, though. I mean,
Huge.
And I have to say, I mean, okay, I agree. The science is very important, especially in this climate of anti-science. And that we need to have some kind of proof to support policymaking, and it cannot just be, you know, my instinct, my gut, my feeling says, my politics. And it's amazing how we're still talking about issues as if we don't have data about them. So, for example, should we strengthen, let's say, low-income households? Will they be better off? Will, you know, their children be better off? Will their families have greater stability? You know, it's been done and proven that the track record for this kind of policy is very positive. And yet, in every election cycle, we talk about it theoretically as if we've never tried it and we don't have data to support it. But there's such distrust and there's so many mixed messages, even within the science community, I'd like to say, that it just, and also, you know, new discoveries, new ways of understanding how one thing interacts with another. They've led us to question, you know, to hedge, let's put it that, at the very least to hedge, if not to just be paralyzed. There is that, or to be entirely reckless.
I agree. I mean,
depending on the regime and the government, right? So there is that. There's like either like, oh, the science is this, let's all run into, you know, off the cliff, or, well, precautionary principle to an extent where, which is, it's a good thing, I'm not saying, but it could also lead to paralysis. And this idea that there is, you know, you're saying that you're finding the environmental community, you know, unwilling to really work through these issues, because we do need solutions. We are trying to decarbonize. We are trying to, you know, get to the point of, in any event, mitigating the disaster that is upon us. But we're now also doing it because for so many years that we've been talking about it, the scientists have talked about it, the environmentalists have talked about it, nobody did anything. And now we're at the edge of the cliff and everybody's saying, well, look, here's all the money and here are some pathways. Let's just do it all right now and we'll figure it out later because we're at the disaster zone. So I think that there's tremendous anxiety, I think, in different instances. And throughout this conference as well, we've seen, you know, so many of the problems, the rhetoric, the geopolitics, the dichotomy between the developing and the developed world. There's a question by Roland on the Q&A. In Germany, it says a new supply chain act has been created. Companies are held accountable to comply with standards in their supply chain, corporate social responsibility. Is this the way to go? Are there similar efforts in the US? Anybody?
There are similar, and I'm in favor of that. I mean, I think regulation is very important, and the kind of very science-driven regulation in Europe in many cases, like product take-back regulations, fantastic. You know, you create incentives for companies to return products so you have less impact. There are some of these innovations, like the Amazon fund that Julie was referring to. There are financing mechanisms. But when it comes to project level development and dealing with these macro challenges, like, you know, sourcing metals to meet the Paris Agreement targets, no one has done, the UN Convention on Climate Change, no one has done any analysis on, okay, if we all really want to meet the targets, what are the scenarios under what kind of materials do we need to meet those targets, right? Each person comes up with their own analysis, but I think we need to figure out something more comprehensive. And one of the key issues is the transition bit, right? So like when you were talking about these subsidies that Julie is very rightly alluding to, agricultural subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, they are driven by livelihoods, right? It's the politicians, and this is sort of what, you know, Mansur Olson warned us about in his famous book, The Logic of Collective Action, that you get these special interest groups who lobby and they create inefficiency in democracy, especially in democracies. And so what ends up happening then is you get these subsidies being given to generate livelihoods. Now, what do you need? You need a livelihood transition. You have to get the coal miners away into other jobs. So that's where the investment needs to go. And there is some good work being done. Bloomberg Philanthropies has a whole program that's focused on coal communities to transition them to other jobs. That's when the subsidies will go down, because renewable energy is getting subsidies too, for the same sense of like, we need to give this a start so we can incubate the sector. And that's all fine as long as it's got good social value too, which of course the fossil fuel sector does not have from a long-term perspective.
So I know that Julie answered this in the Q&A, but there was a question about the international mining companies commit to transparency and integrity in running their operations. Why are they not required as a consequence to release their cost structure for remediation? Why don't we address that a little more publicly? I mean, Julie, you did have an answer for this.
Yeah, I'll say it was, I think I would have proposed a different paper for this conference had I known that I would run into so many barriers. But actually, I think that, as I said in the response in the Q&A, I think that actually a lot of the transparency requirements or guidelines or initiatives that are required for certification or what have you are all about preventing the disaster. One. And what I'm trying to find out is what the cost actually has been for remediation on different timescales. And two, the kinds of embodied multi-generational health impacts that we, as I mentioned in the study, that we understand better in relation to lead and aluminum and cadmium, and are only beginning to understand in relation to rare earth elements. These sorts of things are difficult to quantify because often that first step of quantification comes in the context of trying to establish some sort of liability linked to a specific firm. However, given the extensive number of causal factors for Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, we can get at these costs a different way, right? By looking at public expenditures, economic analysis of household expenditures and things like this in countries where there is data, and the US is one of them. I do think, though, that a relatively easy fix going forward would simply to be a requirement that the cost data following cleanup action, whether it's mandated to a specific firm or whether it's overseen by multiple public entities and private contractors, needs to be published somewhere, right? You can dump it somewhere and let the researchers run and play with it, right? That does seem to me to be a relatively low-hanging fruit.
Well, I don't know if it's low-hanging, but
relative.
It's certainly something I would like to know.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many ways that this could go. I do want to say though that one of the things that that comes up. Well, first I have to ask a question about oceanic mining because I'm amazed. You've raised so many interesting questions about that. I wouldn't have expected. Or rather, I should have expected, given that I read some of the stuff. But the idea is, I'm loath to oceanic mining practice because it feels as if we got the terrestrial mining all wrong. Now we're moving into an even more to the wider unknown, deep sea mining, and who knows when we'll know, what kind of damage we've done there. And I understand what you said, that we need to be selective because not all areas are the same. But I mean, are we confident? I mean, does it seem, can we make a set of rules that gives us confidence that this is not going to be a, oops, I made a mistake?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Moment?
And my apologies, I'll have to run after this response for this other call. But just in terms of oceanic mining, the main issue is social versus environmental impact to a large degree, because here you have and human-linked environmental impacts. Clearly, you would potentially have risk to marine life, but that too needs to be studied and evaluated. I gave you an example that in the deep sea, you have no plants. So you take out an entire trophic level. So of course, any human activity has some impact, but it's a matter of comparing. But the biggest advantage I see for oceanic mining, which is why I became interested in it, is because I've studied all the conflicts on land with communities. There are no human communities in the deep sea. There are not even any islands around this area where the deep sea mining is proposed. So it's not even like you're saying, oh, there will be some coastal fisheries which will be impacted. The Clarion-Clipperton Zone is a very specific area where these nodules are there, where you don't have that. So that's the major reason why. And then the second is that there is a governance mechanism, which has been there for 20 years, which has UN member states, which is now formulating environmental regulations. So that needs to be given a chance. That's all I'm saying. It may well be that for a specific project, you do the assessment and you say, no, go. But you have a governance mechanism which has much more vigilance than one nation state would have with a particular corrupt government. Here you've got 170 odd member states who are still governing that. We don't have anything like that for terrestrial mining. So I hope, but I will come back and
Thank you. I'll see you in a little in the post
thank you
conversation.
so much.
I just wanted to share, since we're sharing some news. I was involved in the publication of a Carnegie EU report that is really talking about how Europe has been talking about ecological security and now needs to talk more about ecological diplomacy, and about how all of these plans, the green plans that we talked about so extensively, we're so proud of, in the previous couple of sessions, also have, as we saw, ramifications. Like when big countries or like the EU or big institutions, World Bank, global institutions, make up a set of rules and set up a set of standards, all of this immediately impacts the neighbors who may not be able to catch up as quickly or will then have to adjust in order to be able to either export or work with or follow the lead of the greater players. So I'm putting the publication in the chat. It's been studied by different contributors on the economy, on the ecology, the whole thing about ecosystems. I think it's such an important part, and especially now, the ecosystem degradation, environmental biodiversity preservation should not be lost in this race again for us to decarbonize the economy while also trying to maintain all these growth rates and the forward movement at the expense of more holistic approaches. Does anybody else want to say a few parting thoughts here? I want to thank everyone. Julie?
Yeah, I actually, thank you so much for sharing this report. There's been a sort of recurring geographical imaginary that I've picked up over the course of our time together over these past few days that I'd like to draw out and gently challenge, if I may. And that is this contention. I'll just share my screen here. That most or many of these resources are located in developing countries. And now when you look at a map, and actually one of the figures that Salim showed during his talk, critical mining density is actually really highly concentrated in North America and Australia. And actually, these elements are, there are of course pockets and hotspots and that sort of thing, but they are dispersed throughout terrestrial space. And so, one of the things I really was mulling over last night and this morning is like, if we can look at a map like this, and we can still say that these elements are concentrated in developing countries. What is it that we're actually seeing? And I would posit that maybe we're reading a little bit of the history and present of extraction into these maps that actually show us a different thing, and I think therefore a different set of possibilities. But of course, what is potentially daunting about that is that this different set of possibilities brings to the fore a very different set of responsibilities for those of us who are not accustomed to living in mining territories or in countries where the economy is oriented overwhelmingly toward extraction. And we've seen with moves in the US and Canada and in the European Union, and this is, I think, a key part of ecological diplomacy as well, a move to really fundamentally shift that so that extraction is occurring closer to home, closer to our backyards.
Okay, this is a wonderful, I guess it's a wonderful way to kind of wrap up, but it also opened a whole slew of new questions for us to examine. Not only you're the geographer, but I've grown enamored by maps of late, all kinds of maps, because I'm finding that there's such a wonderful way of reimagining the world. And so just, you know, Arjun showed a map and you showed a completely more crowded map. Arjun map was telling one story about the developing world, emphasizing this. You're saying, well, let's look at it more broadly. This is another map which shows that even though we think there's no mining here, there not only is there, but it will come closer to home as well. And what do we think about that? What do we say about that? How do we live with that? How do we want that to be? I'm assuming that those are many of the questions that you're raising here. Thank you so much for that. I think it's great food for thought. Parting thoughts, Arjun?
Yeah, no, I mean, you just gave me food for thought, but I think, you know, combining those maps just paints a pretty revealing picture of how complex and interconnected these global supply chains are. You're getting the product from one place, you're transporting it to another for processing and manufacturing, and then you're shipping it off to consumers. So understanding all those linkages becomes ever so important. Understanding where those customers are become very, very important. And, you know, the one thing that we didn't talk as much about in this session, but I'm sure it was covered in others, but the biggest challenge that a lot of these large corporates are having are not so much on measuring and looking at the transparency around scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. It's really the scope 3. And that's why you see some of the majors not even committing to scope 3 yet, because even if they do, it's such a difficult thing to measure and manage, especially when you're looking at these maps and the different routes these minerals take before becoming a final product. So I think digging deeper into those areas, and then also working across mine. This is not just a mining thing. This is looking at mining technology providers, looking at transportation sectors, and really bringing these stakeholders around the table. I mean, it's a lot easier said than done. But if you don't get sort of cross-industry collaboration on this, then we're not going to make as much progress as we hope to and need to. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for joining. I want to thank all of our panelists, everybody who tuned in to listen and ask questions. We'll be sharing this on the Caltech YouTube channel. This concludes the 2 days of our public programming. Panelists reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. on a Zoom link that we've already designated. I'd like to thank Jed Buchwald and Dan Lewis and Caltech and the Huntington for a wonderful year, despite COVID, and for really opening new horizons and forging new partnerships and new relationships. Thank you all so much.